Section 4 of Rambles in New Zealand by John Carne Bidwill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswax Candle. March the 2nd, 1839. Several of my natives being unwell, I left them behind till my return, and started for Tongariro with only 2 of the lads I brought from Tauranga. Peter went with me, and several people from Watuiti. As usual, the men carried the children, and the women the potatoes, etc. The procession was closed by 1 or 2 pigs, which, from the opposition they made to the efforts of their drivers, seemed to have as great a dread of Tongariro as the Maoris themselves. The road led over a tolerably level country, covered with grass of many different kinds. The most common was a large wiry one, which I should not think good for cattle. There were, however, many which would be well worth cultivating. I have sent specimens and seeds of most of them to England, where I think they will thrive as well as in their native place. We skirted the base of the mountain in order to get at the best place for the ascent. We found the ground in general marshy, and crossed a great many small streams and nearly dry watercourses filled with large stones. The great width of these places would indicate that at some seasons of the year the whole of this country would be impassable from the quantity of water. This was a very dry season, but yet had not dried up the wet places in the moors, although it had nearly exhausted the torrents. We were on Tongariro all day, but the peak was never visible in consequence of the mist, which always covered the upper regions. I several times accused the natives of leading me astray, as I could not make out the direction in which we were going as compared with that of the peak as I had observed it from Taupo. About 4 o'clock we arrived at the junction of 2 considerable watercourses, where my guide said we must stop, and as I could not see any vestige of wood anywhere else, I agreed. After we had been there about half an hour, the clouds rolled out of the upper end of the valley where we were, and I saw that the cone was close to us, and then found that this, if any, was the proper place to ascend, which the natives still maintained was impossible. The trees which grew here were small, stunted coniferous or taxaceous and composite ones. There were none except on the sides of the watercourse, and they did not lift their heads above the level of the top of the bank on which they grew. The stream which here runs down from the mountain is, I have no doubt, from observations I made afterwards, compared with what I observed at the time of the general direction of the country, the one called the Waipa, or western branch of the Waikato. It is here a noisy mountain torrent about 4 feet deep. I regret that I did not ask what they called it, and it is very likely they knew it to be a branch of the river called the Waipa when it flows further to the north. I found out that the road we had travelled was one which formerly led to some part of the Waikato country, but was now disused, and that it was the only place where the base of the cone could be seen, that no one had ever approached nearer than we now were, and that the reason was, they were afraid. They said that formerly, when they passed this point of the road, they used to cover their heads with their mats, because it was taboo to look at the mountain, or at least the peak. The night was exceedingly cold, but I did not feel it so much as I did on the Waikato. I found here a most curious little plant of the yew family, Dacrydium. It was not larger than a clump of moss, and was mistaken for a moss by me when I first saw it. I found here also the curious Forstera sedifolia, and many new composite plants and veronicas. March 3rd. When I arose in the morning, I was astonished to see the mountains around covered with snow, except the cone, which was visible from its base to the apex, and appeared quite close. The natives said the mountain had been making a noise in the night, which at the time I thought was only fancy. There seemed to be a little steam rising from the top, but the quantity was not sufficient to obscure the view. I set off immediately after breakfast, as all the others were afraid to go any nearer to the much-dreaded place. Nor could I persuade the 2 who did set off with me to go within a mile of the base of the cone. They, however, made a fire of such small bushes as they could collect, and waited for me till I got back. As there was no road, I went as straight towards the peak as I found possible, going over hills and through valleys without swerving to the right or left. As I was toiling over a very steep hill, I heard a noise which caused me to look up, and saw that the mountain was in a state of eruption. A thick column of black smoke rose up for some distance, and then spread out like a mushroom. As I was directly to windward, I could see nothing more and could not tell whether anything dropped from the cloud as it passed away. The noise, which was very loud and not unlike that of a safety valve of a steam engine, lasted about half an hour, and then ceased after 2 or 3 sudden interruptions. The smoke continued to ascend for some time afterwards, but was less dense. I could see no fire, nor do I believe that there was any, or that the eruption was anything more than hot water and steam, although from the great density of the latter, it looked very like black smoke. I toiled on to the top of a hill, and then was much disappointed to find that the other side of it, instead of being like what I had ascended, was a precipice, or very deep ravine, with a large stream of water at the bottom. With some difficulty I managed to get down, and on ascending the other side I found myself in a stream of lava, perfectly undecomposed, but still old enough to have a few plants growing among the fissures. As I progressed towards the cone, which now seemed quite close, I arrived at another stream of lava, so fresh that there was not the slightest appearance of even a lichen on it, and it looked as if it had been ejected but yesterday. It was black and very hard and compact, just like all the lava I have seen in this country. But the 2 streams were very insignificant, not longer at the utmost than 3/4 of a mile each. I had no idea of the meaning of a sea of rocks till I crossed them. The edges of the stony billows were so sharp that it was very difficult to pass among them without cutting one's clothes into shreds. I at last arrived at the cone. It was, I suppose, of the ordinary steepness of such heaps of volcanic cinders, but much higher. I estimate it at 1,500 feet from the hollow from which it appears to have sprung. It looks as if a vast amphitheatre had been hollowed out of the surrounding mountains in order to place it in. The sides of all the mountains around are quite perpendicular, and present a most magnificent scene. A circular plain of sand at the northeast base would have been a fitting scene for the wildest piece of diablerie that had ever entered the brain of a German, or was embodied by his pencil. Thermometer at base of cone, fine sunshine, 65 degrees in sun, no shade to be had. Barometer, 25 14/20. The cone is entirely composed of loose cinders, and I was heartily tired of the exertion before I reached the top. Had it not been for the idea of standing where no man ever stood before, I should certainly have given up the undertaking. A few patches of a most beautiful snow-white veronica, which I at first took for snow, were growing among the stones, but they ceased before I had ascended a 1/3 part of the way. A small grass reached a little higher, but both were so scarce that I do not think I saw a dozen plants of each in the whole ascent. After I had ascended about 2/3 of the way, I got into what appeared a watercourse, the solid rock of which, though presenting hardly any projecting points, was much easier to climb than the loose dust and ashes I had hitherto scrambled over. It was lucky for me another eruption did not take place while I was in it, or I should have been infallibly boiled to death, as I afterwards found that it led to the lowest part of the crater, and from indubitable proofs that a stream of hot mud and water had been running there during the time I saw the smoke from the top. The crater was the most terrific abyss I ever looked into or imagined. The rocks overhung it on all sides, and it was not possible to see above 10 yards into it from the quantity of steam which it was continually discharging. From the distance I measured along its edge, I imagine it is at least 1/4 of a mile in diameter. It is very deep. The stones I threw in, which I could hear strike the bottom, did not do so in less than 7 to 8 seconds, but the greater part of them I could not hear. It was impossible to get on the inside of the crater, as all the sides I saw were, if not quite precipitous, actually overhanging, as to make it very disagreeable to look over them. The rocks on the top were covered with a whitish deposit from the steam, and there was plenty of sulphur in all directions, but the specimens were not handsome, being mixed with earth. I did not stay at the top so long as I could have wished, because I heard a strange noise coming out of the crater, which I thought betokened another eruption. I saw several lakes and rivers, and the country appeared about half covered with wood, which I should not have thought had I not gone to this place. The mountains in my immediate neighbourhood were all covered with snow and much below me. I could not see the sea in any direction. The natives said that from a mountain near which they pointed out, I could see Taranaki and the island of Kapiti in Cook Straits, and as this was much higher, I ought to have seen both places from this spot, but the south and east were entirely invisible from the cloudy state of the sky. I had not above 5 minutes to see any part of the country, as I was enveloped in clouds almost as soon as I got to the top. As I did not wish to see an eruption near enough to be either boiled or steamed to death, I made the best of my way down. It unfortunately happened that the highest part of the crater's edge was to leeward, otherwise I might have stayed there a little longer. I had not quite got down to the sandy plain I have spoken of when I heard the noise of another eruption, but am not certain it came from the crater I had just visited. I thought at the time it came from another branch of Tongariro to the northward, on the top of which I had seen a circular lake of water when on the peak. I was half frozen before I reached the ravine and thoroughly drenched by the mist, so that I was very glad when I found the place where I had left the natives and the fire. I got back to the tent about 7 in the evening. The barometer stood when at the base of the cone at 26 1/10 inches, but I could not take it up further than the streams of lava, as I had quite enough to do to get myself along without having anything to hold. The natives said that they had heard the eruption which took place as I was returning, and that the ground shook very much at the time, but I did not feel it, perhaps because I was too much occupied with the difficulties of my path. When I returned, I was much annoyed to find a party of natives, consisting of 3 chiefs from Taupo, who had come, they said, to see how I was. Had they brought any provisions, I should have not cared, but being chiefs, that was impossible, and it was equally impossible for me to tell my natives not to give them any. The consequence was I was obliged next morning to return to Rotuiti, instead of staying another day at the mountain, as I particularly wished, and intended, being in fact completely eaten out of house and home. March 4th. I sent off all the natives but Morningal, who was quite my right hand, and told them to have a canoe waiting on the side of Rotuiti about sunset, and to have the tent pitched in readiness for me. I then gave Morningal a kettle of hashed pig's head and some cold potatoes to carry, taking a kit in my own hand, set off in the direction of the watercourse in order to botanize. I found the red-flowered variety of the flax, Phormium, growing in the wet places almost as far up as any plants except Veronicas. Perhaps this sort would be more advantageous to grow in England than the large common kind. The fibre is equally strong with that of the pale-flowered sort, which is not the case with another species I found afterwards growing on other mountains, which, however, I take to be a distinct species, not a mere variety, as the seed vessels were hanging instead of upright. I also found a perfect yew about 2 feet high. The only perceptible difference, except in stature, was that the seed was not quite so much embedded as in the English yew. Barometer at encampment, 26 19/20. Thermometer 45 at 9 p.m. Cloudy mizzle. I waited several hours collecting specimens and seeds, but afterwards recollected many plants which I had left behind, thinking I could get them nearer home. It will be a lesson to me hereafter never to omit securing a specimen when I first see it. I have lost dozens of new plants by omitting to do so, thinking at the time that I should be sure to get finer ones as I went on. There was but little forest in the line of march today. The little clumps of wood which were met with here and there contained mostly araliaceous plants, strongly resembling those on the coasts, but really different. In the watercourses were totoras and caikateras, as the natives said, but I think they were different trees from those so called by Europeans and the natives of the coasts. A dracaena was very common, which grew to a tree 30 feet high, 2 feet diameter. If I can manage to get this tree to England, it will make quite a new feature in ornamental plantations. There are 3 species here which would grow outdoors at home. One is very beautiful. We approached the lake about sundown, and I rejoiced to see a tiwai waiting for us among the reeds, as I was tired with carrying so many specimens. I was no sooner seen than several lads set off to relieve me and Morningal of our burthens, and carry us into the canoe. How such an act of courtesy came to be extended to my companion I do not know, he being a slave. I suppose, however, they saw he was a favourite of mine and thought to propitiate me by it. There was a large flock of the small black and white tropic bird, I do not know its scientific name, hovering over the lake. These were the same birds I saw among the lavas of Tongariro. They have white bodies with some black feathers about the wings, black marks around the eyes, the characteristic long feathers in the tail. There are also large and small gulls, a small black and white cormorant, and a large black one, and plenty of ducks. They were, however, all as wild as I ever saw the same kinds of birds in England, except the cormorants. These and the ducks are common about every river and lake, but the tropic birds I never saw anywhere else except on the coast, and the gulls were rare in the other lakes. The great abundance of all birds seen on Rotuiti was, no doubt, on account of its shallowness, and the great quantity of mud it contained. The natives said there were no fish in the lake except what I saw, and which were not much more than an inch long. The natives had vast quantities of these dried in baskets, which they cook by making them into a kind of soup, but which did not smell sufficiently nice to tempt me to taste. The tent was pitched under some totara trees in a very fine open wood, at a sufficient distance from the native huts to avoid fleas, and for a wonder, with the mouth to leeward. They had generally made a practice of pitching it with the door fronting the wind, as I took care to see that they did the contrary. I could only account for it being otherwise tonight by supposing that the wind had changed after the tent was pitched. Mahia, whom I had left here because he complained of being ill, was very glad to see me, more especially, I dare say, because he said they had been rather sparing of their potatoes while I had gone. March 5th. It had rained hard all night and continued to do so this morning, but I was determined to start. I had been very particular in asking the natives if we were sure of going back the same way we came. They said yes, that it was the only way. But after going about a mile, I saw they had been deceiving me, so I went back by myself to get a guide to take me over the mountain by which we had originally arrived at Rotuiti. While I was endeavouring to persuade someone to go with me, Peter came back and we started together. My guide was a most deserving fellow and well merited the fig of tobacco I promised him. He went first and cut all the branches and small trees out of my way, actually working as if he was going to earn his life instead of a fig of tobacco. Our course was directly up the side of the mountain, the top of which we arrived in about 4 hours, all of us perfectly drenched and dreadfully cold. When we arrived at the top, I could not for some time find out the road by which we had before got there, which I should not have much cared about, but that I could not see the tree for which I had taken so much trouble. I was, however, very glad of it afterwards, as during my search, which took up several hours in heavy rain, I found a new Dracaena, one of the most beautiful I had ever seen, the leaves being large and striped with red and yellow. It must also be very hardy, as the natives said that this mountain was always covered with snow in the winter. The Dracaena was growing in a little gully at the very top, where the barometer stood at 25 and 11/20, thermometer 45. I have been fortunate enough to secure a plant of this Dracaena, which is now growing in Sydney. After a long search, we found the track by which we had passed over the mountain, and by following it, I found the tree which had caused me so much trouble. Strange enough, it was the only one of the kind I ever saw. I dismissed my guide, giving his wife a fig of tobacco as well as himself, with which he seemed as delighted as an English labourer would have been by a person giving him £1,000. Indeed, I doubt whether the latter would have shown half so much joy. The view of Taupo from the summit was magnificent. Immediately beneath our feet, on the Tongariro side and about halfway towards Rotuiti, was a small lake on the side of the mountain, which I had not seen in my former survey of this part of the country. I should certainly have tried to reach it had it been finer weather. It was about 1/4 of a mile across, completely surrounded by forest. The curious part of it was that it was situated on the side of a steep mountain without any level land near. We arrived at Taupo before the other party, and I was half afraid they had again been deceiving me and were gone to some other village, which would have been particularly disagreeable, as they had the tent and all the provisions with them. I was, however, soon relieved from my apprehension by seeing them turn the corner of the mountain where it abutted on the lake. I was visited by several of my patients, most of whom said they were better for the physic. There was one old man, a great chief, and a very quiet old fellow to whom I had been loath to give any physic, as I could not find out anything the matter with him beyond old age. I was, however, agreeably surprised to find that he fancied himself much better, and brought me a pig in return for his rangwao. He always had a little girl with him, I suppose his granddaughter. As he was a very quiet, gentlemanly old man, I did not like to offend him by refusing the pig, but gave the little girl some beads, and him a fig or two of the weed, in order to make it up with him. Shortly afterward another pig was brought as a present for me, because I had ascended Tongariro. I could not find out who sent it, and was obliged to let the natives take it along with them. I found it had been given by some person on the road, and been driven on by some of the hangers-on of my party. This was a curious circumstance, as most of the natives were exceedingly jealous of my achievement. Firewood was very scarce here, so that I was obliged to buy it by giving an inch of tobacco for a backload, a very high price considering the ordinary prices current of New Zealand. Went a short distance on the lake back to the village where Mr. Chapman's house was building, in order to please Peter. March 6th. Had some difficulty in getting a canoe today, owing to a disinclination on the part of my natives to leave the place. I do not know what had become of the canoe we brought with us, but suppose some people wanted to go to the other end of the lake had taken it with them. When I found out that there was no disinclination on the part of the natives at the village to lend me a canoe, but that only my own natives wished to throw obstacles in the way of going, I soon got over all difficulties by a few figs of tobacco judiciously applied. I was told, just as I was thinking of starting, that the chief of Taupo wanted to see me, and was waiting for me. I accordingly went to a place where they pointed out 3 men sitting very gravely. The one in front was the chief. He was a remarkably fine man, upwards of 6 feet high and very strongly built, a complete giant. He was also very handsome, and one of the fairest of the New Zealand men I ever saw. Indeed, I have seen but few women fairer. He did not appear in a particularly good temper, and after about 5 minutes' talk, he suddenly arose from his seat and began to walk up and down and stamp, talking all the time with great animation. He at last worked himself apparently into a most terrible pitch of fury, at which I only laughed. The cause of complaint was my having ascended Tongariro. I said that a Pakeha could do no harm in going up, as no place was taboo to a Pakeha, that the taboo only applied to Maoris, and that, finally, if the mountain was an atua, I must be a greater atua, or I could not have got to the top of it, and that it was all nonsense to put himself in a passion with me, as I did not care for it. But if he would see that people made haste with the canoe, I would give him some tobacco. I then took out 1 fig for each of his companions, who sat still all the time without saying a word, and gave him 3 figs. It proved a most astonishing sedative. He quite changed his tone in a minute, and sat down again. He could not help saying, however, that if he had thought I could have gone up the mountain, he would have prevented my ever trying it, and requested me not to tell any other Pakehas of it on any account. There were no great thanks due to any of them for letting me go, when they had done all in their power to misdirect me, but I thought it as well to let the matter rest, and shook hands with him. This chief was the most important man I met with in New Zealand. That is to say, his supremacy over the other chiefs was more widely acknowledged. This personal influence had, I suppose, been acquired by his superior courage and physical strength, for in reality all the chiefs are equal by hereditary right, and in all the other tribes it would be difficult to say who was the first chief. Here, however, and throughout all the different villages of the Taupo tribe, he was acknowledged as the great chief. He had crossed the lake on purpose to see me, and I supposed was rather annoyed to find that I thought of going away without shaking hands with him. He said during his rage that he did not eat white men, a pretty strong hint that there were plenty there that would make no difficulty about the matter. This was the only time that a native ever said anything to me more than impertinent, and I believe that the greater part of his rage was put on in order to try if he could not frighten me. In consequence of these interruptions, it was about 10 o'clock before we could proceed. Peter took leave of me here, as he was going to remain to superintend the erection of Mr. Chapman's house. He brought a pig as a parting gift. He was a most excellent specimen of a native, had been of great assistance to me, and I was very sorry to part from him. I gave him a knife, some beads, and about a pound of tobacco. But his joy at receiving such a magnificent present was not sufficient to clear up his countenance. Mr. Chapman, in speaking of him afterwards, said that his chief fault lay in his heart. It was as soft as a piece of dough, and that he never had reason to find fault with him, except for not knowing how to say no to the other natives. We had not paddled above 7 or 8 miles when the lake became so rough that we could not get on any further. We were on a lee shore, with the rocks rising perpendicularly more than 600 feet above us. Fortunately, we were able to run under a natural arch, where we got shelter till the rain moderated. When finding there appeared no chance of the gale abating, we encamped, there fortunately being just enough room under the rocks to pitch the tent. I was much annoyed, and at the same time amused, at this place by the superstitions of the natives. Being wet and cold, as soon as I got out of the canoe I told them to make a fire. Accordingly, they took the fire they had in the canoe, and putting it as near the edge of the water as possible, blew it up, and added what small driftwood they could find on the beach. Presently it began to rain again, and I took up a log and threw it under a projecting rock, where I saw an old mat and some sticks and rubbish. Immediately they set up a terrible outcry that the place was taboo because someone had died there. I said I did not care, but they gave me to understand that if I persisted they should all die. I assured them that if they did not make the fire nor come near it, certainly nothing could harm them, and as for myself I was very willing to run the risk. At last they gave in, seeing I was determined to have my own way. I wanted something to eat, and told them to put my pot on. It was brought, and I placed it on my own fire. However, seeing that theirs was better than mine, I took it off and carried it over to theirs. Before I could set it down, they snatched it out of my hand and made a worse outcry than ever. Their fire was taboo. It was fire they had brought in the canoe and was not for cooking. I was greatly annoyed and gave them a good scolding for their nonsense, telling the missionary lads that they ought to know better than to attend to such stuff. At length they agreed to make a fire in earnest, especially when I pointed out to them that unless they did so, they would have nothing to eat most likely for that day and the next, as it was not probable the swell on the lake would subside very quickly after such a gale of wind. When they had pitched the tent and lighted the fire, I allowed them to kill a pig, which set all right. At all events, I heard no more about the taboo. The gale increased all night, and it was lucky I had broken the taboo at the corner sheltered by the projecting rock, of which the natives now gladly availed themselves. I think if it had not been for this, they would have died of the wet and cold, as there was no possibility of making a shelter of branches, etc., which they usually do when they have occasion to sleep in the woods in bad weather. March 7th. Detained at the taboo place all day by the heavy swell. The wind began to subside about midday, and the rain ceased. Found several curious plants, an andromeda, and a very curious rubus with a gigantic woody climbing stem, the plants and leaves covered with bright yellow prickles. March 8th. Obliged to make a start this morning, although the lake was still very rough, because we had eaten up all our potatoes and almost all the pork. We did not, however, advance very far, as the lake continued so rough that it was very dangerous. We landed at the first small beach we could make, and again pitched the tent on account of the rain. After 2 or 3 hours, as the wind had fallen a great deal, we again set off, and were fortunate enough to reach our port in safety. As we went on, young Pirata asked me to fire a gun to inform his father of our return. Soon after I had fired, we saw smoke ascending, as a signal that we had been observed, and about 3 o'clock reached the place from which we had originally embarked on Taupo. Found old Pirata still there and expecting us. He had got another pig for us and plenty of potatoes. He was exceedingly glad to see us again, and my natives stayed up all night relating my exploits in ascending the mountain. As the journey was over so far as my extra hands were concerned, I paid them off. There were 8 of them, whom I had employed for 8 days, and I gave each 5 figs of tobacco and a pipe, with which they were perfectly satisfied. I also gave half a fig each to my own natives, and one to Rangi-o-Nere, the chief who had come with me from Rotorua. This was rather a treat to them, as I had kept them very short for the 2 or 3 previous days in consequence of their bad behaviour. I gave old Pirata 20 figs and a pipe, and a knife to each of his sons who had been with me the whole time, and were as good quiet lads as one could wish to meet with. As for the old chief, he was really quite a gentleman of the old school. There was a quiet, unpresuming dignity about him, which nobody could fail to observe and admire. It was a most kindly meant thing of the old man to send his sons with me, and they were of great use as letters of introduction. In fact, of far greater use than 9 out of 10 of such letters which I have delivered. The natives about Taupo were not so well-looking a set as they are in some other parts of the island. This was more remarkable in the women than in the men. The handsomest girls I saw were 2 daughters of old Parata, with their fine mats wrapped around their waists, looked quite as graceful as many of the pictures of Hindu girls I have seen in similar dresses. Or rather, I should say in dresses similarly worn, for the thick New Zealand mats would not be very comfortable dresses in India. The older women, and especially those who have children, wear their mats over their shoulders instead of round their waists, which is not near so graceful, but becomes them better, as they do not consider suckling improves the form, especially among those who, like the New Hollanders, etc., suckle their children over their shoulders. End of section 4.